I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country right across this land and the incredible care that they have shown, lived with over millennia, the knowledge that they've acquired through careful observation. And what an opportunity we all have to learn and to honour that in our everyday. And we hope that these forums that Nillumbio presents and other activities go some way to enable those things to happen. So today we've got Michael Smith here. He teaches conservation land management at Melbourne Polytechnic, and he's going to discuss a few really important ideas about how we can care for a place. And it's going to tie in really well with the Bio Blitz, the Great Southern Bio Blitz, which starts Friday until Monday, which we encourage you all to participate in, mainly focusing on your backyards. And we've got a forum on Thursday that we encourage you all to attend. We'll be sending information out about that very soon. So in the meantime, here's Michael, and thank you for attending, everybody, and thanks for sharing your ideas and knowledge, Michael. See ya.
No worries. Thanks everyone for coming. Share my screen. So this presentation is called Creating Habitats and Surveying for Native Fauna on Your Property, Steps to Consider. So there'll be multiple pictures across most of my slides. So I'll try and talk to the pictures as well as describing some of the points I'm making on each slide. So this is a Jackie lizard, which you can find in the Nillumbio Shire. It likes to hang around fallen logs and debris on the ground. It'll also scutter up trees as well. So loves diverse habitat in the understory, especially logs. So logs are really important for this species. Quite difficult to come across. I have encountered it around the St Andrews market, so in that bush area behind the market there. There's lots of fallen logs there, so it feels really comfortable there. It can come out slightly in the open, but also have that cover if it needs to go and hide. So logs are really important for habitat. First thing when you're thinking about habitat is you've got to think like an animal. So what would an animal want in a habitat within a landscape? And to grasp that concept, it's not too difficult because as humans, we're animals too. And all animals need core things within a habitat. Some of these are food, so they need to be able to access food, so they have energy. What do they do with that energy? That allows them to move through the landscape, find mates, find places to hide, escape, raise their children. Shelter is really important as well. If they've got no places to hide, and that could be hiding from abiotic conditions or hiding from predators, they're unlikely to want to be in the habitat. They need to be able to find mates as well. So they need to be able to procreate. So if the area is not diverse enough or not large enough, potentially the area won't be large enough for mates to be within that zone. Complexity is really important. And what I mean by complexity is not a monoculture of the same habitat. So you need ideally plants of different sizes. So that's different heights, different widths. You need plants that are prickly. You need some plants that aren't prickly. You need plants that are going to provide different types of food. You also need an understory that's really complex as well. So you want logs, you want leaf litter, those sorts of things. So that's what I mean by complexity. Ecosystem size is quite important when it comes to abundance and richness of animals within an area. The larger an area is, the more it can sustain and support. Another thing about a larger ecosystem is that it has a reduced edge effect, and I'll go into that in more detail a little bit later on. But essentially, a smaller area has a larger edge relative to the core habitat in the middle of an area. On the edge, it's more open to predators, more open to weeds, more open to extreme conditions. So on the right here, I've got an imperial blue butterfly, and that was photographed near Ben Friley Oval around the Diamond Creek. So for this butterfly to want to be in an area, there needs to be certain things. So it needs food. So it often likes to feed on sweet Basaria plants, but it also needs acacia trees as well, because that's where it lays its eggs, on those trees. They pupate, and then the caterpillars feed on those trees. But it also needs to be supported by certain ants as well that protect the larvae from predators such as wasps. So you need a few things going on in an area. You need the food for the adults, so they can get the energy to move around. You also need the particular acacia trees. Now, they could be blackwood trees, they could be silver wattle, and you need the ants. So there needs to be a few things going on in a habitat. So when it comes to a habitat, you want all the elements. If there's one element missing, and that could be food, could be a substrate, it could be places to hide, then the animal might go somewhere else. So it's really important to think of the core elements within a habitat and try and provide all those things within your backyard if you can do it. On the left here, we've got a southern brown tree frog. They can live near water, but they can also be terrestrial as well. So the adults, they may live in the leaf litter in a terrestrial forest, for instance, where they can search for insects and get some cover. When it comes to breeding, they need a water body, and that's where they lay their eggs, sometimes on submerged plants, or sometimes in the riparian area. So riparian means the area either side of a water body. So there might be such things as reeds there or grasses, and they might hide there. They might also look for insects, and they lay their eggs there as well. So there's a lot of little elements that go into creating habitats for animals. If you miss one or two of these elements, often they'll search further afield to find somewhere else. Once the traits of an ecosystem established, you need to figure out how to provide food, shelter, chances of finding mate, complexity, ecosystem size. Now, you can attribute all those traits to specific animals. So you can try and provide food for a particular type of bird. You might be able to provide food for a particular type of butterfly. So this is the tricky part. It depends on what native wildlife you're attempting to attract and protect, and often that boils down to the size of your property. Do you have a large enough property to have large trees with hollows for birds, or do you have a small area? It might be 10 meters squared, and as a result, you might then focus not on birds that live in hollows, or they could be owls, they could be rosellas, could be galahs, and maybe you focus your efforts on thinking about insects or lizards that can hang in the understory. Regardless the size, there are some standard things to do that will help cater for many species and help decipher what to do. So sometimes it can be, quite complicated to think exactly what an animal might want in an area, but you can do some certain things that are going to cater for a wide range of animals that are known and proven to be good things for native fauna in the Nillumbio Shire. So on the right here, we've got a type of hunting spider. So this is an ambush predator. So it doesn't create webs like some of the orb weavers you have in Nillumbio, such as the St. Andrew's spider. So they need cover in the understory because they're ambush predators. So they need logs, they need leaf litter, those sorts of things. So cleaning up your property and removing logs and leaf litter can be really problematic for some of the smaller animals, such as ambush predators, as this jumping spider. And in turn, these jumping spiders become food for trophic levels further up. So they could be food for smaller birds, for instance. On the left here, I have a photo of a ochre skipper butterfly. Now, this ochre butterfly is feeding on purple loosestrife. So purple loosestrife is a plant that flowers later on in the year. You often find it flowering around a water body. So a good example is the wetland opposite Benfriley Oval, where it flowers en masse from about sort of December roughly to around February. So that provides a lot of food for some butterflies, and the timing of it flowering is really excellent because the ochre skipper butterfly and some other butterflies choose to fly and emerge later on in the year around January and February. So how do you find out what animals want in a habitat? And it's quite a tricky thing to do, but the best thing to do is to start observing nature when you go for your walk. So when you go to a conservation area, that might be a dedicated conservation area, or it might be an area just along a creek line. And if you think about, if you've been for a walk around the Diamond Creek, there's a half decent riparian area. So there's a number of plants growing either side of the water body. And one of the main features there is the old manna gums that we have there. They have lots of hollows, and you see birds interacting with those hollows. You can see musk lorikeets, you can see rainbow lorikeets, you can see both species of corella you get in Nillumbio, but you can see the galahs, and they're interacting with those hollows. Now, these large manna gums not only provide homes, but they also provide lots of food. So at some times of the year, they have copious amounts of flowers. So in February, a lot of the manna gums were flowering, and as a result, you had, in some days, hundreds of musk lorikeets feeding up in the canopy and then searching for hollows as well. Not all parrots and cockatoos and those sort of birds will feed right up in the canopy all the time. They also like open spaces. So you'll see them from time to time feeding on grasses in the open areas around Benfriley Oval and also Ferguson's Paddock. Now, that is an absolutely perfect area for them. It's the best of both worlds because they can handle open space where they're comfortable enough feeding on the ground because they're largest birds, but also they can go up in the canopy and they've got those hollows. You take those manna gums away from around the Diamond Creek there, and you're not going to get the same amount of parrot-like birds. So observing these sorts of things can then give you some information about what sort of restoration works you might like to do in your yard. Observing animals interacting with plants is called function. So when you're going for your walks, you can take mental notes of how these birds are interacting with certain plants. So on the right here, we have a galah, and that's in a hollow that was photographed by a student at Melbourne Polytechnic along the Diamond Creek. On the bottom here, we have a kookaburra, and this is also photographed by a student at Melbourne Polytechnic. So we first spotted it on the one side of the Diamond Creek, and we could see it peering down in vegetation. Then suddenly it flew off, got to the ground, then picked something up, and then we scudded across the bridge and then got to see it resting on a branch on a tree, and then lo and behold, it had a snake in its mouth. So without that sort of diverse understory, the snake wouldn't have been there. Without those branches, then the kookaburra can't rest and then have its food, because it likes to be, perched when it's trying to feed. So these sorts of things are really important. Complex habitat, so it's not just the same trees, it's not just the same layer of plants. You're having your trees, you're having your understories, you're having these dead sort of broken branches, and that all this habitat comes together to provide a good habitat for animals. So absorbing information from nature. So on the left here, we have a mistletoe bird. Now, mistletoe birds like to predominantly feed on the berries of mistletoe trees. The mistletoes will grow off eucalypt. So you need the eucalypts there to have the mistletoe. And then Once the mistletoe's there, then you get the mistletoe bird. Now, predominantly the mistletoe bird, as I said, feeds on the berries of mistletoe. So without the mistletoe, then you might not get the mistletoe bird there. There's a whole range of birds that feed on the flowers of mistletoe as well. One of them being the spinebill. So often you can see the spinebill and the mistletoe bird within a mistletoe batch within a tree. It's pretty special. Again, the mistletoe provides food for Jezebel butterflies, and that's where my cursor is here. But predominantly the Jezebels will hang around mistletoe because the mistletoe is a food source for their larvae. So they like to lay their eggs on mistletoe vegetation. And the mistletoe is growing off eucalypts, and the Jezebel butterfly will feed in the canopy amongst the eucalypt flowers. This is a type of thornbill here where my cursor is. These small birds love shrub canopy. Well, the brown thornbills do anyway. So really prickly acacia plants are excellent for small birds. Gives them cover. They can move through the landscape in the shrub layer. Then they can duck down to prostrate plants, pick off some insects, pick off some berries, then move back to the shrub, and then keep doing that zigzagging form as they move throughout the landscape. Here we have a musk lorikeet, and this was photographed in February. In late February, a lot of the manna gums along the Diamond Creek had finished flowering and were going to seed. So initially we were seeing lots of musk lorikeets there because they were feeding on the copious amounts of carbohydrate in the manna gum flowers. Once they flowered, the musk lorikeets still needed some food. So there's lots of tree violets in the understory along the Diamond Creek. So they were switching from the flowers up top, and then they were feeding on berries down below. Here we have a spotted pardalite bird. Now, these spotted pardalite birds love stringy bark trees because they can pick off easily the bark from these trees, and then in turn they can use that bark for their underground homes. They also use grass as well, so which is depicted in this pic here. So this bird has picked off a bit of grass, it's rested, scanning the landscape, seeing if there's no predators about, and it's going to duck down into its home and then start building a nest. So observing these sorts of things can be really important to give you an idea of what you might want in a habitat if you want to protect these animals and start luring them into your property. So complexity. So thinking about different layers in your yard is really important. So today I went for a bit of a walk along the Darebin Creek, and what I saw, so I'm living in the northern suburbs at the moment, was a couple of bird species hanging in the river bottlebrush, which is where my cursor is, and then to the right there is a sweet Basiria tree. So they were moving in this sort of shrub small tree layer because they felt comfortable there. They were picking off seeds from the sweet Basiria and insects from around the bottlebrush. So it was the brown thornbill, and then also the silver-eyed bird as well. And there was a group of them. There might have been 5 or 6 of them. But without that shrub layer there, those particular small birds would not be comfortable to move throughout that landscape. So a lot of small birds really love cover. And ideally, you would have some acacia plants there as well with their prickles, because that keeps away a lot of the mammal predators that might pick off some of these small birds. And in the understory, you can see that there's a lomandra here, and there's a few other grasses dotted about, likely to be poa grasses. And so birds can move throughout this landscape as well and have cover, and so can some reptiles as well. Having a diversity of layers is really important because it also means you're going to get more species within your yard. Some species, for instance, the spotted pardalite, predominantly like to feed up in the high canopy. They will come down lower in the ground to get grasses for their homes, but predominantly they move up in the top canopy. That's the same with the striated thornbills as well. However, the brown thornbill, they like to move in the understory. So you see a lot of brown thornbills in the Smith's Gully walk from Peter Frankie as you're moving towards the St Andrews Market. You also get scrub wrens as well, and they prefer the understory. But as you move up, you get different birds in the shrub layers, and then you get different birds in the canopy. So if you have different layers, that means it's a little bit more complex and you're going to get a higher richness of birds within your yard. Leaving logs and leaf litter is really important because that provides habitat for reptiles and insects. It gives them the confidence to come out in the open a little bit, knowing they're not too far away from a log where they can hide from a predatory bird such as a kestrel or a kookaburra. And within the leaf litter, there's lots of insects, and that in turn becomes food for a range of different insects. So you take the leaf litter and the logs away, you're taking a lot of food away from other animals. And as I was saying earlier, if you have one element missing, you might have a range of different hollows, but if you don't have food there, then those birds have got to move somewhere else. It's just like us. Ideally, you have a lot of the things pretty close to you. You don't want to ideally be traveling, 200 kilometers to go to work. You don't want to be traveling 60 kilometers to go to the supermarket. It's the same with most animals. Some animals are prepared to fly. A lot of bats will fly kilometers and kilometers to go home or to travel for food, but a lot of birds, reptiles, and so forth want a lot of these elements within their habitat that is quite close by. So artificial habitat can be really good as well. So I'll show you that in another slide. Large trees are really important. It takes a long time for large trees to grow to provide hollows, at least 100 years. So a lot of trees that have multiple hollows might be 150, 200 years old, and it's very hard to replicate that in a landscape. You can build habitat homes and erect them in the trees, but more often than not, the best homes are the hollows. The thicker wood holds temperature better, and they just seem to be better as opposed to the habitat homes that are erected. So here's another slide that talks about complexity. So in the left here, this is a Jackie lizard. So I was doing some surveying in the Whittlesea Shire last week, and we came across a few different logs. And more often than not, the Jackie lizards that we discovered were either close by the logs or actually interacting with them. So we spotted a Jackie lizard under a log here. So you take that log away, potentially that lizard wouldn't be there because it needs cover. Here's another example. There were so many logs, and as a result, we were seeing quite a few Jackie lizards. Reptiles will come and bask out on the logs as well because they're cold-blooded, knowing that they can quickly duck off. They also find a lot of food, insects under the logs as well. So it's perfect habitat for reptiles. Those reptiles in turn can be food for other animals as well. Down here on the right here, we have a photo there's a little hole which I drilled in a log, and there's a masked bee that's making its little home here. So what it does is it's laid some larvae, it's gone and got some food, it's put that food within the hole, then it's going to seal it up. So little holes within logs, branches, even old fence posts that have a lot of holes in them. The fence posts often have slits in the wood as well. They can be really excellent habitat for lizards as well. So a lot of those things that you're thinking about taking away from your property actually can be really good habitat for animals. A great example is some of the old acacia trees that you have. So as they die and their bark peels off, you can see lots of holes within that wood. Those holes are made by the larvae of moths and beetles. So they're eating the cellulose of that. That's giving them energy. And eventually they pupate into adults. Once they're flying off, those holes are still there, and in turn they can be homes for other insects such as bees, such as native wasps, such as beetles. So although something seems to be dead, potentially it can be providing structure and habitat for other animals. On the top right here, we see a number of different logs here, which providing good habitat, but we also put some tiles out here, some roof tiles as well. We're using a range of different tiles just to see the results we get with the different types of tiles. Tiles a pretty good habitat for reptiles because they hold the heat. They're also a good way of surveying, because if the reptiles are going with under the tiles, you can pull them over and it gives you an idea of what sort of animals you're getting in the landscape. So not absolutely ideal having artificial habitat, but sometimes in replace of other habitat, it can be good. And to grow a tree, for that tree to drop branches, to drop leaves and so forth, takes time. So whilst that's developing, sometimes artificial habitat in the meantime can be a good idea. So here we have a skink. This was photographed in a reserve between Kangaroo Ground and Warrandyte, and that was hunting spiders. So as I was saying before with that ambush spider, that likes to hang around leaf litter and logs, feeding on insects. And in turn, skinks can be there as well, because they can then feed on the spiders and so forth and the larger insects. So once you take leaf litter away, you're not getting these smaller animals, which are really important for ecosystems. They start breaking down some of this material and composting it, which in turn is good for the plants. And also they provide habitat. So here's an example here of a couple of trees with a lot of leaf litter underneath it. And we've got some grasses as well. So insects can move through these grasses. Ideally, they'd be a little bit larger. They can move through the corridor of grasses. They can duck off, look for food within the leaf litter, and go back to the cover of the grasses. On the left here, I have a fantail. This was photographed in one of the Panton Hill reserves. It was continually going back with food, I'd say every minute or two, and it was exchanging roles with the other parent. So one parent would come back with food, one bird would stay and the other parent would go get food. If you look at this nest here, the nest is mostly made up of grasses and also spider web. So the spider web is holding the nest together. So without spiders in the landscape, without a diverse, rich understory of grasses, potentially it would be challenging for this nest to be built. Maybe that would be enough for fantails not to want to be in the area. There also needs to be a range of different insects. So the greater diversity of plants and abundance of plants, more likely to be insects. If we look on the right here, we have a sweet Baseria branch that, by all counts, there was no flowers on them. These are old seeds here to the top right. So it didn't look like it was in very good shape, this branch. However, there was a range of bees here that at night time, they go and sleep on these branches. Now, to me, it looks like they are just part of the branch. They're just an extension of what looks like potentially a little bit of disease here or old seeds. So unless someone had pointed this out to me, I wouldn't have picked up on these bees being there. So old, what looks to be dead things can be really important in the landscape. Again, grasses are vitally important in the understory. Here we have a bright copper butterfly related to the Alpine coffin butterfly. That was resting in January on these old red anther wallaby grass stalks. Now, it was pretty much basking in the sun. They're cold-blooded animals. They need that heat to then be able to fly around. So what it was doing, it was going to sweet Baseria plants, feeding, then it was coming back to these old grass stalks where it was actually resting. Now, it actually lays its eggs on the sweet Baseria plants as well, so that it's sweet Baseria is a larval food source for this particular species. But some butterflies will lay their eggs on grass stalks. So it's really important that grasses are in the landscape. Here's an imperial blue butterfly. Again, it was resting on some Themida, which is a type of grass. And it was just having a break. A lot of animals like to rest. They can't be continuously moving. So if they can get a bit of cover and also rest within grasses, that could be the difference from them being in a zone and not. So here's an example of a diverse understory in a reserve in Diamond Creek. This flowering plant here, a lot of these pea shrubs are commonly referred to as egg and bacon. It's a type of Darwinia species. Butterflies will rob nectar from these plants, so they don't actually go in from the front. They appear to come in from the back to me. and get some nectar. A range of different bees will feed on these flowers as well. So it's this particular reserve, it was just humming with indigenous bees. There was trigger plants scattered about this reserve as well. That was drawing in a lot of bees. In the understory, I seen a thrush. Sorry, not a thrush, a quail. I think it was a painted button quail that was moving through the understory, seeking cover on the grasses. Great habitat for skinks because of the grasses, also because of the branches that have fallen down on the ground. So whilst it looks unkept, whilst it looks untidy, it's very natural. It's so diverse, this particular reserve, and that's mostly because it's got different structures within the understory. It's got shrubs, it's got trees, it's got lots of logs. As a result, you're seeing heaps of insects, some reptiles, and a range of different birds, and it's actually quite a small reserve. So it's an excellent little reserve. So when you're creating habitats, another thing to consider besides complexity is thinking about the different life cycle stages of insects and animals, and the different behavioral traits of the different sexes. So here's a good example. On the right here, we have a thin-winged wasp, and on the top of its thorax is some pollen glands, which it has got from a wine-lipped spider orchid. So the wine-lipped spider orchid is one of the famed orchids in the Nillumbio area. So it lures in this particular wasp because of pheromones it sets out. The pheromones mimic the female thin-winged wasp, so the male comes in and pseudocopulates with it. In the process, it gets pollen on its body. This particular part where my cursor is called the labellum. Supposedly that may resemble the female as well. Now, for this thin-winged wasp to pollinate this particular orchid species, there needs to be some other things going on in the area. It needs to seek some food. It needs some food somewhere else. So wasps are often drawn to white flowering plants because they do a lot of their sensing with their antennae. Antennae predominantly sense with smell and touch. So wasps' eyes are not particularly good. But they like white flowering plants because often they have a strong perfume that lures in the wasp. So this particular wasp may feed on this Olearia ramulosa species here. That gives it the energy. It can fly around. In turn, it can find some orchid species and hopefully pollinate them. But the male wasp wants the female around because it wants to, produce offspring. So the female needs to be taken care of as well. So the female wasp actually can't fly. She spends a lot of her time underground feeding on grubs, and these grubs are in turn feeding on poa species. So here's a poa here in the middle. So to protect this orchid species, you need to think about the male wasp, you need to think about the female, you need to think about their behavioral traits. Here is a particular butterfly species called the dusky blue. I've only been able to confidently ID the dusky blue butterfly in one reserve in Nillumbio. And when I went to this reserve, it was exactly what this butterfly wanted. It had a range of different grasses which it could rest on, and it could also bask on the grasses, which is what it's doing in the middle photo here. On the right here, you can see that it's feeding on a particular pea species. It was also feeding on bearded heath as well. So I haven't got a photo of the bearded heath, but there were pea species and bearded heath scattered on this small slope. So there was so much food for this butterfly. There were heaps of old grass flower stalks for the butterfly to feed on, but also it had the larval food source. So if you look quite closely, you can see these little round clumps in the middle photo here. So this plant here is called Dottor l'Oriole. I don't actually know the species, but the butterfly was laying its eggs in the Dottor l'Oriole. So it had places to rest. It had food. It had places that it could lay its eggs on. So it was ideal for this butterfly. It's species. It looked like it was having a blast in this reserve. Here we have an ochre skipper butterfly. In January, February, in summer, the gullies in Smith's Gully, where there's a lot of Lomandra and sweet Baseria growing, you'll see these butterflies flying around. They can be quite slow, then suddenly they can just whip about the landscape and be very fast. So the Lomandra they use to lay their eggs on, I should say, and they feed on the sweet Baseria. You take the sweet Baseria out, then potentially you might not get this skipper species. The next thing to consider is indigenous plants. So when you're trying to create habitats, you're trying to lure in native animals, your best bet is to use indigenous plants because animals over a very long period of time have evolved relationships with indigenous plants. Classic example is a number of the small bee species that you get in Nillumbio. Here's a bee species here on a trigger plant. They often have small tongues. The small tongues are suited to some of the herbaceous indigenous plants that you get in Nillumbio. You often see them flowering in springtime. Now, they're not suited for some of the larger bees. Some of the larger bees are too heavy for the plants and also have a tongue that is too large. So the smaller bees have formed these relationships with a lot of these small herbaceous indigenous plants. Timing is really important as well. So as I was saying before, the ochre skipper butterfly starts emerging and flying around in late summer, and it just so happens that there's a number of wetland plants, gypsywort, persicarius, purple loosestrife, that happen to be flowering at that time. So these relationships, they just seem to work. A lot of bird species, for instance, they need hollows. A lot of trees that aren't indigenous won't, have these hollows forming in their trees, and the hollows are really important for not only birds but also mammals as well. A range of different animals are attracted to certain coloured plants, and so a lot of the indigenous plants have these particular colours. It's also really important when you're planting indigenous plants to think about when they're going to be flowering. You don't want all the plants flowering en masse at once. You want some plants flowering in late summer when there's not a lot of other plants flowering. That will provide food sources for animals that come out later in the year. So sweet Baseria is an absolute fantastic plant. From early to late summer, you can get individuals flowering, and they're absolutely laden with beetles. You'll get some moths there. You'll get a range of different wasps and bees as well. So really excellent plant to have because it's flowering later on the year. Hot gardenia is another great plant that flowers a range of different times during the year. So something else to consider with indigenous plants. A lot of bees that do a hell of a lot of pollinating of indigenous plants are attracted to ultraviolet colours. So this bee species we have here is in the Lasiogossum genus. It has a small tongue. It's attracted to the chocolate lily plant here. They tend to see ultraviolet colours. They also see yellow as well. So ultraviolets, your pinks, your purples, your blues. But they also really like yellows as well. They don't tend to go to red flowers as well. They don't see that spectrum of light. So ultraviolet colours are really important. If you go wandering around in springtime in a number of the reserves, you'll see that a lot of the flowering plants in the understory happen to have ultraviolet coloured flowers. So here we have purple loosestrife. This is a cuckoo bee. So the cuckoo bee follows around the blue banded bee, and then it lays its eggs in the blue banded bee home. So they come out roughly when the blue banded bee does, which is sort of from sort of November, December, all the way to February. So as you can see, this is a purple type flower, or pinky purple. And on the right here, we've got a leafcutter species, and that's attracted to Wallenbergia. So blues are a really good idea when you're thinking about buying while propagating understory plants. On the left here, we've got a bulbine plant species, and we've got a bee getting some nectar and pollen from this plant. So yellow flowers are a really good example. You'll see lots of yellow flowers in the understory around Nillumbio. On the right here, we have a Murnon plant, and there's a little Lasioglossum species. And there would have been, I think, from memory, about 3 Lasioglossum bees just coming backwards and forth from the Murnons, and probably a small 10 by 10 meter area on this particular day. Excuse me. So when you've got bees coming in attracted to certain plants, you're also going to get some other insects as well. So, arthropods, I should say. So here we have a spider, and that's ambush predator, and that's waiting for other insects such as your wasps, such as your bees. So spiders are really important because they keep things in check. If you didn't have predatory animals, then suddenly the trophic level beneath them, their populations would skyrocket, and then potentially they could have devastating impacts for the plants. So you want predatory animals such as spiders to keep other insects in check. So spiders are really important to have in the landscape. This is a type of bee fly here. So it's masquerading as a bee, but it's actually a fly. Flies will go to a range of different coloured plants. They don't seem to be all that picky, although they do often go to white flowering plants. So flies are really important. They do a hell of a lot of pollinating in Nillumbio, and probably the most common insect you'd see in the understory in Nillumbio would be the hoverfly. White flowering plants are awesome. They attract probably, I would say, the greatest diversity of pollinators and insects. They often flower later in the year. So all 3 species pictured here from the lepidospermins. So they're like tea trees, kunzias. They'll attract a range of different flies. We've got a bush fly down here on the bottom. They do a lot of pollinating. Here we've got a jewel beetle. And then on the right here, we have a drone fly. So flies are really excellent. They do a lot of pollinating, and the white flowering plants keeps the insects ticking over later in the year. Here's another couple of species here. We've got the 2-spotted blue here. Again, that's feeding off a tea tree. So that was in January, I'm pretty sure, from memory. And we've got a grass plant here on the right here, and this is a brown butterfly. And that's, that's having a great old time. But there were multiple species of butterfly on this particular day in St. Andrews. There was also the yellow admiral, and there was a skipper butterfly species that I can't recall as well. So there was 3 species of butterfly going backwards and forth from about 3 or 4 flowering grass trees. Here's another example here. So here's a masked bee, and that's feeding on the nectar and also the pollen. We have green and gold nomia species down on the right here, and up the top there, I can't identify that species, but it's a type of bee. So eucalypt trees are really special. As I was saying before, they take a long time to grow, and they provide a lot of homes, shelter, places to raise young, and copious amounts of carbohydrate for some species. So in sort of July, August, you might start hearing the wood ducks calling. So they're going around, they're looking to mate, and they'll raise their young in hollows. On the right here, and they've just started to come back into the landscape, is the sacred kingfishers. So they have their young within these hollows. They'll go around, search the landscape for dragonflies, other insects, yabbies, depending on where they're situated in the landscape. They'll bring the food back for their young. On the bottom right here, we have a musk lorikeet species. And as I was saying, there was hundreds of them in February feeding on the manna gums. And in turn, they not only feed and pollinate the eucalypt species, but they also live in the hollows. So hollows are really important. So if you've got them in your landscape, really important to try and keep them, even if they're not flowering and they appear to be dead. They're really important. Shrubs and small trees. So yeah, as I was saying before, shrubs are really important because birds can seek cover and they can feel comfortable to move down the landscape, move back up to the shrubs, and then zigzag throughout the landscape. On the right here, you see a restoration plot around Coburg. So this was basically just grasses at one point, and slowly but surely they're bringing back these structured layers. So they didn't add any leaf litter on the ground there, but if you plant a range of different plants, they're going to provide that leaf litter. In turn, you're going to get the lizards, you're going to get the insects, and that'll provide food for other animals as well. So there's Limandra species here providing cover. Shrubs are starting to grow. Here's a hot gardenia plant. We've got sweet Basseri here. Underneath the canopy trees, you've got some acacia species. Then above them, you've got your canopy. So ideally, you have the canopy, tall trees underneath the canopy, shrubs, and then a diverse understory. So being realistic about what wildlife you can cater for in your yard. Do you have 20 meters squared? Do you have a 17-acre block? Do you have large established trees? And so you can't have absolutely everything. Some people don't have large tall trees. Some people don't have, enough space to have a corridor of shrubs. But there's generally an opportunity somewhere within your yard to provide habitat. You just need to be realistic about what that's providing habitat for. It might be just for some of your smaller animals, such as your insects and your skinks, for instance. If you have a large area, that's fantastic. So some of the things to consider if you have a large area is to try and leave your old dead trees. Even though they might not look alive, they can still be providing habitat. They could have little holes that grubs have made in them. They could be homes for small bees. They could be hiding places for insects. And if they have hollows, then they're going to be probably excellent hiding places and places to raise young for cockatoos, owls, and so forth. Leave leaf litter. Leaf litter is really important for insects. Without that leaf litter, you don't get those lower trophic level animals. Grasses, whilst they can be a bit of an issue in places, especially around the fire season, if you can leave some patches of grasses, it can be a really good idea. Butterflies lay their eggs on the grasses. They're hiding places. They're resting places. There's a lot that goes on in the understory. If you wipe it all out with brush cutting, then that can be detrimental not only for those levels, but also the other animals. Reducing edge effect, which I went over before, but we'll go over it again in a later slide. Protecting water bodies is really important because you're going to get animals that you don't get in other places. Today, for instance, I went for a bit of a walk around a wetland, and there were some reeds there, and I happened to hear the call of the reed warbler, and there was also some thornbills interacting with those reeds. Without those water body, those plants can't grow there because they need the water to survive. Without those plants, you don't get certain birds. So water bodies are really important to take care of those plants that you don't see in a range of other different landscapes. Diversity is key, so thinking about those different layers, and also within those layers, thinking about different plants. Don't just plant that same species within that layer, bearing in mind some plants do really well and they're trying hot conditions of Nillumbio. So some plants are good bang for your buck, but just don't plant that plant exclusively. So water bodies, here's an example of a wetland near the Ben Friley Oval. There's a range of different sedges and reeds in the riparian area around the water body. As a result, you can hear reed warblers there. You get scrub wrens, you get your fairy wrens, you get thornbills. There's also been a rail spotted there as well. So that really great habitat for birds. Also, because of that water there, it provides some moisture for plants that flower later in the year. So purple loosestrife, some of your gypsy worts, they'll flower later on in the year. And it's a great place to see butterflies and insects in February, March. Bees love it as well, blue-banded bees, cuckoo bees, some of your leafcutter bees. So they're really important places in late summer where a lot of other plants have done their thing because it's too hot. So edge effects. If you do happen to have a decent sized yard, one of the best places to protect and look after is on the edge of your plot. If you can plant out from your edge, what that means is it reduces the edge size relative to the core habitat in the middle. So if you think about that sort of brownie area being the edge, as you plant out from the edge, it reduces the percentage of the edge relative to the core area. So whilst the edge in terms of meters is going to increase, it's actually going to reduce its size relative to the core area in the middle, which is this green area. Core area is where habitats tend to be more diverse. There's more material for nests. There's more places to find mates. There's more places to hide. The weather tends to be more conducive there because on the outside it can be a bit more extreme with the winds. You also get predators that come through the edges. So reserves might back onto other houses, for instance. There might be cats that wander about from these houses. There might be weeds that start building, moving in, I should say, from the outskirts. So if you can reduce the edge, just means the habitat is a lot better. Another thing to consider is linking your patches. So if you can imagine that you're a bird and you don't like to go out in the open and your habitat is within B, you're not going to go to patch A and patch C unless you have these corridors. So corridors are basically narrow strips of vegetation that provide cover. So if you can provide these two corridors, you've at least tripled the size or habitat, I should say, for a bird to interact with. So the corridors themselves can be a habitat as well. So a bird in patch B, it might be a thornbill or scrub wren, can interact in the corridors, but it also can go to the patches. And patches tend to provide more. They're a bit like those larger areas with reduced edges. They tend to provide more area to find a mate, more places to hide, more food. If you have a large area, leave the mistletoe. The other day we were surveying in Whittleshire Shire, and there was 5 or 6 bird species interacting with the mistletoe in the space of sort of half an hour to an hour. Here we've got the brown-headed honeyeater. You get your spinebills, which is on the right here. You get your yellow-faced honeyeater. You get your mistletoe bird as well. So you get a range of different birds. Now you take that mistletoe away, you may not get all these species, albeit the brown-headed honeyeater, spinebills, they can feed on other plants, but they do really love the mistletoe. And the mistletoe bird, well, that predominantly feeds on the berry on the mistletoe. Also great for butterflies. This is a Jezebel butterfly. Generally, it feeds on the eucalypt flowers, also feed on the flowers of the mistletoe, and the mistletoe vegetation is somewhere they can lay their eggs. So it continues the next cycle, the next generation of animals. Now, if you have a small area, you're likely going to have to scale down what sort of animals you're trying to protect and look after, but they're no less important. If you're looking after your insects and your lizards, they in turn can be food for other animals and keep that chain, keep that ecology happening. So again, even in the understory, you can think about diversity of layers. So here, where my cursor is, we have some smaller grasses. They might be wallaby grasses, they might be microlina, and then you get some of your poa species. So even within that grass layer, thinking about different sizes, different shapes of grasses can be really important. Increase that diversity in a small space. Poas are really excellent because they tend to form those tussock shapes, which means they block out a lot of light and space for weeds, which is really excellent. So it helps control weeds. Also tend to provide more cover and space for insects to lay their eggs. So here's an example of my yard. So when I first moved in, it was just grass in the front yard. And so I wanted to add some diversity there. So I was thinking about what sort of plants I could plant there. And I wanted wildlife to come more or less, straight away. I knew that shrubs would take a wee while. So here's a genus Defolia plant. So I propagated this plant from seed in Cottesbridge. Now, that's slowly but surely growing, but it's going to need some other shrubs there to draw in the small birds, because one plant on its own is not going to be enough. But it was providing pollen a few months back for some insects. So that was pretty good. Got a golden wattle plant here, and that was just by having that one plant, it was providing enough cover because it backed onto these trees in the neighbouring property. So wax eyes, or you might know them as silver eyes, were moving through the next door neighbours' properties. Then they were coming to my tree. So slowly but surely, when I get more shrubs and trees growing, that will link to my neighbouring property, even though there's a fence there, because the trees are growing up above that fence. So it's providing that canopy level. Then in the understory, I've got some brachyscomes here. You might know it as cutleaf daisy. I've got some dianellas here, and they were providing excellent food for bees and butterflies. So I'll show you some of those photos later on. I've got some branches there, and I've also got some stones there. So the stones there are hiding places for skinks. They haven't come back in yet, but I was fighting spiders under there. I was finding beetles, and that in turn becomes food for other birds. So here's another example here, another angle. So you can see a little bit more here that I'm starting to get some grasses to pop up here. Here are some of the poas here. Some of these smaller grasses with the darker green blade. They're wallaby grasses. Got some flax lilies. Some of the shrubs are starting to grow. Finding it challenging to grow shrubs up against the wall there because they're not getting a lot of that westerly sun. But they are growing. It'll just take maybe two or so more years than ideally would be the case. I've got a blackwood species here on the right here, and I've got golden wattle. So eventually, if I have more of these plants growing, I'm going to start seeing more smaller birds that can pick off the insects off these leaves and move through the cover of the canopy. I should say the shrub layer. So this is a little area I had in the front here. So where my cursor is, so it's about 2 meters by 3 meters squared. The house looks a little bit different because it's had a render. So I knew that I couldn't really grow too many shrubs or trees there. It wasn't really, because it's really only getting a few hours sun per day in summer. So that was a bit restrictive, but within those restrictions, I just thought about what plants I'm going to plant. So I thought about some really hardy species. So I've got dianellas here, those yellow flowering plants, they're chrysocephalans, so some paper daisies and some brachyscomes. I've put some logs down where my cursor is, and I've got some basalt rocks there as well. I'm getting a range of different bees there, native bees that is. I'm getting some skipper butterflies. I'm getting some blue butterflies. And as those insects start coming in, then you start to get some of your predatory spiders that start creating those webs, start catching some of those insects. So it is a real ecosystem there, even though it's 3 by 2 meters. In turn, those insects move throughout the landscape. So a lot of insects, they don't mind not having cover all the time. So then they can move from my spot and then they can move to a neighboring property. Here are some of the species. So I've got Brachyscombe, Austral Storksbill, and Chrysolocephalum here. All three of these, well, Brachyscombe and the Chrysolocephalum, they draw in bees. They'll also draw in butterflies. Predominantly, this geranium here in the middle only attracted skipper butterflies and the odd blue butterfly. Out the back here, I had some bricks here where I hang my washing. So I decided to remove some of those bricks and then create a bit of a diverse layer. So again, there's some common plants, Poa species. They're tussock forming. They provide a lot of cover. I've got my cutleaf daisy here, got some dianellas and some shrubs slowly starting to grow. So this is Corea glabra. So there's 2 or 3 corals there. Doesn't get a lot of sun because of the houses and the walls either side. Even so, if you select hardy species, think about diversity of layers and plants within the understory. I'm still getting some insects there. I'm still getting bees, still getting the odd butterfly. Not nearly as much as my plots out the front of my house, but even so, I'm still getting some insects here. Here's a log here. I turn over the log. I'm getting some scarab type beetles. So I was pretty happy with that. Here are some of the insects. Here on the left here, this is a type of wasp. So it's a predatory wasp. I know it as a gaster wasp, but I think it's called gasteruption is the type of genus. And so they go around, they feed on your plants, then they lay the eggs and other species of juvenile insects. So they're in turn keeping populations in check. So wasps can be really important. Here I've got a green bottle fly that's feeding on the Brachyscombe plant, that's pollinating it, and then that's going around doing some other pollination. Here I've got a skipper butterfly, so it's called a grass dart, and that's feeding on the geranium. And here is a drone fly, so it's masquerading as a bee. When I first saw it, I thought it was a bee, but as I got closer, I could see that it was a drone fly. So these insects started coming within a few months. So basically those photos of my yard, 6-7 months. So it's still developing, but within a few months, I'm starting to get some insects. And these, I just wasn't spotting these insects originally. Here is a bulbine lily I planted, and here's a native bee, and here's one of the flax lilies with the lasioglossum bee feeding on it, and you can see it's got a pollen sac here, so it's taking the pollen off the plant and in turn going to other flax lilies and pollinating it. So some key overall points for creating habitat: diversity of plants. So thinking about diversity in the layers, so understory, keeping the leaf litter, keeping the logs, keeping the grasses, and within the grasses, different sizes of grasses. Thinking about those shrubs, then thinking about those tall trees, then the canopy trees. If you have different layers, if you can in your property, then you will draw in more animals. Acacia shrubs are really important for small birds and insects. The small birds really like the prickly acacias. They feel comfortable moving through them. Large trees are great, whether they're alive or not. They're still providing habitat. They're still providing function. If you have a small yard, you just need to scale down your thinking about skinks, small birds and insects. This life, although it's small, just as important as some of your larger animals. Indigenous plants are key, so pretty much only protect them if you're thinking about drawing in native fauna. Don't clean up your yard, leave logs and leaf litter. So now we get on to the surveying bit. So when it comes to the Biblets, or whenever you're doing survey in your yard, a good thing to think about is when are animals active. If you're coming out during the day, then it might be hard to record a mammal that comes out at nighttime or a frog that calls at nighttime. So spotted marsh frogs, they start calling in August. So be mindful of when the animals are going to be active is really important. Marsh frogs, they'll call during the day. They'll also call at night time. So if you're doing a survey for marsh frogs, it would be fine to go out during the day. My experience is that southern brown tree frogs, they prefer to call at night time. So if you were targeting southern brown tree frog, potentially you would also do a survey at night time. Phascogales are nocturnal, so you often see them coming out at, well, you don't often see them because they're pretty rare, but if you were going to see them, it would be at night time. And also they tend to be more active in winter when they're searching for a mate. Some butterflies will come out in early spring. Some of your blue butterflies, painted lady, the meadow argus, they tend to come out earlier in the year. If you're looking for ochra skipper butterflies, they're later in the year. So you need to do a little bit of research before you're conducting your surveys to target certain species. Where are animals active? That's really important. If you're miles away from the water body, potentially you won't hear marsh frogs. Marsh frogs like to be by water. Phascogales, well, they like stringy bark trees. They also like tiny little hollows. So what you could do is identify where stringy bark trees are in your property with some tiny hollows. You might do that during the day. Then at dusk and dawn, you might sit underneath these trees and see whether they come out of the hollows and start feeding. How to behave when you're surveying. So when you're surveying for frogs, they can feel your vibrations when you're moving. So standing still is really important. So you can move up to the edge of the water body, wait a couple of minutes, frogs will start calling again. Stag watching, which is what I said before, you might identify trees with hollows. I think those trees might be conducive to have animals living in them. So you sit underneath them, dawn and dusk, see if anything comes out. Target flowering plants as well, especially during the day. If you've got eucalypts that are flowering, shrubs or anything, flowers draw in insects. So hang around them. Don't get too close. Binoculars are really important for birds and insects. If you get too close with insects, often they move on and you can't identify them. So yeah, binoculars are really important for insects as well. You can do an active search, so you don't have to be in the one position underneath a tree or under a stag. You can move throughout the landscape as well. So move throughout your property. Change where you're standing. You might be 1 hour, one spot, then go to another spot. So change the different spots you are, survey at nighttime, survey during the day, have binoculars and do a little bit of research on what sort of animals you're hoping to find. And then that might give you some information about where they might be hiding and when they're going to be active. And they're the references. So if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them now.
Terrific, thank you. We do have a few questions and we're aware of the time. So if anyone does need to go, we're going to try and get through as many of these, but if not, we will pose them to Michael and we'll send the responses out to everybody. So in terms of questions, one was, what type of bee was congregating on that sweet Versaria? I believe it must be the one where they were sleeping in a row.
Oh, I don't know what that species was, unfortunately. Sorry, yeah, I couldn't tell. It has a very distinctive white substance underneath its abdomen that I thought would be a giveaway. It almost, to me, initially, it looked like some sort of fungus, but I don't think it is. But yeah, there's a few species that will congregate together and sleep at nighttime. Sorry, I can't answer that one.
That's all right, thank you. Somebody is also asking, they have a property in Eltham where there were a number of native orchids, mainly green hoods, but some others. One day we found a spider orchid, but the next day the flower had been snipped off by something. What would do that, and is it possible to prevent it without disturbing natural behaviour? And this really is a recurring problem with all sorts of interactions with, yeah.
I wish I had more photos that I could show you right now. I've got some on my laptop. So there's a few things you can do. It's likely to be a bird called a chough. They have a bit of an insatiable appetite, but it's not only choughs that do it, it's also millipedes. So the Portuguese millipede can do it. So there's a few things you can do to control the troughs. You can build these cages that you can put over the top of them, but you don't necessarily need to build one. You can go to like secondhand stores, get old bird cages, things like that, and pin them down with staples that you can get from a hardware store. When it comes to the millipedes live in the leaf litter. So you can remove leaf litter in the near vicinity around the plant. So it might be like a meter by meter radius around the plants. And then the other thing that you can do is put some wet vegetation down underneath the tile. So it could be some newspaper, you wet it, you put it underneath the tile, and then the millipedes will congregate underneath that tile, and then you can remove them. So it's almost like what they call a trap crop. So you're luring them into a space and then getting rid of them. It's pretty important that you remember to get rid of them, because otherwise you're just probably increasing their population.
Yeah,
I'd say the choughs or Portuguese millipede.
yeah, and we've seen really great success with the use of both those traps and different caging systems. Depending on what animals you have around as well, you have to build accordingly, whether it's deer or rabbits or. So someone also asked if you can explain the edge effect again, please, but that came in exactly the time that you started talking about the edge effect. So I think that might be okay. Pam, if you give a thumbs up.
Share my screen again and go over it if you want me to.
We'll just wait. If Pam is still here, if they can just say whether that was adequate. In the meantime, someone else is asking, are mirrors or shiny surfaces a good or bad idea to bounce sunlight into small or poorly lit areas?
I don't have a lot of experience with that, to be honest. I think it would be a good idea, and you'd have to be careful, I think, about burning the plants. That would be the only thing I'd be worried about. Yeah, I would take the precautionary approach and try and select plants that could handle those conditions. So some of those plants that I planted are commonly used by councils because they're pretty hardy and can handle a range of different conditions. So some plants, like in the Nillumbio that can handle a range of different conditions are like hop gardenia, which is a yellow flowering plant that attracts blue-banded bees. So if you've got blue-banded bees, you'll likely have cuckoo bees. At my place, and I've only had it planted for a few months. There's a range of different small bees it draws in, and that doesn't necessarily need a lot of sunlight. It can handle slightly wet areas. It can handle dry areas. It's a magic plant. So yeah, Brachyscomia, like the cut-leaf daisies, Dianellas, those sorts of plants that can handle a range of conditions.
We're going to be putting some of this information in the resources pages on the website, and we'll send out the info to people. Yeah. What do you think about increasing the number of hollows by drilling into dead and live trees? So there's quite a bit of research that, demonstrates that just the traditional sort of nesting boxes are problematic, and new systems of actually carving into trees might provide a different solution.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. A lot of those nest boxes, they fall apart. They don't hold the heat the same. Often they're not quite targeting the species they're after. Often they get bees in them. Yeah, they're just not quite ideal. So drilling holes, I think, is a good idea. But also thinking about that next generation of trees, albeit it might take 100 years. Thinking about planting those for the future, and also protecting trees that are already there. So some of those large trees, trying to make sure that we hang on to them.
Yeah, that's right. It's crucial, and with ongoing habitat loss and canopy loss, these are very important issues. How did you get rid of the lawn to start the native habitat? Dreaded lawn.
I have a couple of rhizomia species that grow on my lawn. So I've got like cooch and kikuyu. I dug it up, and I don't necessarily mind weeding. So I go out there fairly regularly. I haven't in the last sort of 2 months. I've neglected it a bit. But I go out there with a hand weeding knife, and then I get the little seeds that have started popping up and the rhizomes that I didn't get rid of. But it's an ongoing process. And I've had a couple of friends say to me that I should have just sprayed it and then got rid of all the grasses and started from scratch. So yeah, there's a couple of different approaches you could spray that would get rid of most of them. Seeds will still pop up, I'd imagine. But I dug it up, and then I just go out there on a fairly regular basis. If my area isn't large, if you've got like a large area, yeah, potentially spraying might be an option.
Or smothering. There's also ways of reducing sunlight.
I smothered for a little bit, and then I took it off, and then I dug up what was there, and I've got to keep going back. If I was to leave that for a year, the grass would just be back to what it was. So
and I think it's
on top of it.
It's a maintenance thing, isn't it? Being part of that system that we create and that we interact with.
You've got to enjoy the process.
Yep, that's right. Someone's asking, is it true to say that if we leave a landscape to develop naturally over time, this is the best technique to produce good local habitats?
Yes, depending on time scale. So if there's a really good piece on YouTube, I can tell Vicky, and she can put it on the on the website by a guy in a place called Akaroa, which is in Canterbury in New Zealand. So there was gorse, for instance. There was gorse growing everywhere. So he convinced this person to give him the land, and predominantly what he did was he just left the gorse there. The gorse provided shade for some of the nurturing indigenous plants. And then as they grew up over the gorse, they outshaded the gorse, and then the gorse passed away. So suddenly you're getting these absolutely great trees growing up everywhere. It needed the old plants there in the first place to provide the seed. But if you've got that sort of thing, then eventually it can take over. But it's taken a long time. And part of the problem is, is the public prepared to see all this wildness and weeds and things in the short term before you get this diversity of indigenous plants? I'm not sure everyone's up for that. And from a council standpoint, they've got a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of considerations. On your own property, if you've got 50 years or something like that. But the other thing is, you've got other considerations as well. It's all very well to have wild areas, but you've got other things to consider in the Nillumbio Shire, like fire and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of considerations that go into leaving things look more natural and wild. It's a bit challenging. One way to think about it is having dedicated areas, that are for wildlife, that potentially don't have them absolutely everywhere. Have these mosaic areas where you're mowing some places, but you're not mowing in others, and you change that up.
And it's also important to consider the dispersal of weed seed and all sorts of other things if you allow things, as you described with the gorse, to change naturally.
Certainly, good point. So if you have indigenous plants, you can let them go to seed, and then that can be great because that can move throughout the landscape and the community. But if
and it's often a great thing to have a little, areas of seed bank that can, naturally germinate and disperse seed. And all these things are complex and so many variables, and depending on
so many variables.
You mentioned the name of a plant with purple flowers and stripes. What was that called?
Was it purple loosestrife?
Oh, purple loosestrife.
Purple loosestrife, that's it. Yeah, so the excellent plant. Like, if you want to see a range of different insects, blue-banded bees, cuckoo bees. If you go down to that wetland directly opposite Benfly Oval, there's a few of them, but it's the one closest to the footy oval and the bowling club. So it's down the slope, closer towards the creek there. And there's purple loosestrife growing there. If you walk, further towards the city, there's another, from the oval, there's another couple of wetlands there. Yeah, purple loosestrife is an excellent plant.
But requires moisture, or?
It does, yeah. It does, yeah.
Someone's asking, will small birds such as pardalotes nest in artificial burrows drilled into rock banks?
Drilled into rock banks? Yeah, not. Couldn't categorically say. Don't know. I'd
They will
imagine.
often.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I've found them nesting in all sorts of places, even in the side of the veggie patch. So
yeah, I reckon they would. I've seen examples of them, going into drain pipe type stuff. Yeah, I'd imagine they would. Yeah.
And it's worth, if you can do it and not harm other things in the process, it's worth a try. I think these things are always.
Someone's just said in the chat that it's in pardalotes and dry stone wool. Yeah, that would make sense. The spotted pardalote, that likes sort of hollow type things closer to the ground, but the striated pardalote, that more or less lives in hollows.
Yeah. Someone's saying yes, hand weeding rather than spraying, and we generally advise not to use sprays wherever possible. I think it's an increasingly important issue to consider, and it does take a bit of hard work. But you also learn so much as you are down in the soil, digging things, turning things over, discovering, every time I pull a weed up, I'm discovering a different kind of insect. So there's plenty of joy to be found in it.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think that's all for the questions. Yeah, I believe that's it. So if we do have any more questions, we will put them to Michael and respond to everybody. Yeah. Thank you all. This is a really terrific insight for, what we can do. And it relates really well to the BioBlitz, which is coming up. So we encourage you all to come to Thursday's forum, which will be a much more conversational process and will lead on from these kinds of ideas. So, we really look forward to having your presence. Thanks so much, Michael. It's terrific to hear about it, and really great. And thank you all. We'll see you again. Bye.
See ya. Bye.